Good morning to you all. Welcome to the second dialogue session in our people's counter-mobilization. Some of you may already have joined in the first session earlier today. Very, very interesting and dense. Some of you may be newcomers, and you are all welcome. The title of this dialogue session is a bit of a mouthfuller: Challenging Multi-Stakeholderism to Reaffirm the Centrality of Public Interest in Legitimate Multilateral Spaces. And that may be a slightly complicated phrase for talking about what might be the most important corporate capture the UN Food Systems Summit is trying to engineer, and that is the capture of the public sphere decision-making spaces in which governments and rights holders should set the rules of the game in place for societies that put people, the planet, and their rights above the market and corporate profits. We'll be hearing more about this in just a minute, but now let me share with newcomers our rules of the game. I think you are all familiar with the interpretation. You know that you need to click on the interpretation button and choose the language you prefer. You know that this session is being registered. You've just heard that. Please use the question and answer option to raise questions that you'd like the panel to address, and do use the chat to introduce yourself to others and for on-the-spot comments as we go along. I'm now going to run you through our program and introduce the people you'll be hearing from. I wonder, is it possible for the panelists to turn on your videos, those of you who are going to be speaking in this panel, if you can? As in the first session earlier today, it's a dialogue between social movement, civil society, people speaking to our concerns, and interlocutors from governments and the intergovernmental world. I'm Nora McKeon, based in Rome. I'm a member of the Civil Society and Indigenous Peoples Mechanism and of the liaison group that has been coordinating the preparations of this counter-mobilization. The co-moderator for this session is Shalmali Guttal, who you see, I think, next to me on the screen. She's director of Focus on the Global South and will introduce herself when she takes the floor. The program is organized in 3 blocks. The first block takes a dig into multi-stakeholderism as compared with multilateralism, and we'll be hearing in a recorded statement, because it's in the middle of the night for him, from the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, Michael Fakhri, and from Sofia Monsalve of FIAN International from Colombia. In the second block, we will see what happens more concretely when these 2 approaches to governance are applied to specific issues: policy responses to COVID-19 and the agroecological transition, and to particularly problematic territories like the Gaza Strip in Palestine. And we'll be hearing from Jomo Kwame Sudaram from Malaysia, the former United Nations Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development and Senior Advisor at the Kadzana Research Institute in Malaysia, from Mary Mubi, former permanent representative of Zimbabwe to the Rome-based agencies and the CFS, from Isa Alvarez from the Basque Country of Urgency, from Andre Luzzi from Brazil, from Habitat International Coalition, and Ahmad Surani from the Gaza Urban and Peri-Urban Agricultural Platform. Finally, at the end, we will ask all the panelists to suggest very briefly key measures and changes that ought to be introduced to rescue governance from corporate capture and put it squarely in the hands of people. And we hope to have time for your input and interaction with the panelists. To facilitate this, we have asked the panelists to limit their first intervention to 5 minutes and their second at the end of the session to 3. And now it's my pleasure to hand over to Shalmali to frame the topic we'll be discussing and to moderate the first break. Over to you, Shal.
Thank you, Nora. A very warm welcome from me also to all of you who have joined from across the world. I'm Shalmali Guttal with Focus on the Global South. I'm joining you from India. Now, the topic at the core of this roundtable is the corporate capture of governance, which is possibly the most insidious form of privatization. Privatization of governance robs people of their democratic agency and rights to justice, dignity, and accountability, and enables corporations to put in place regimes that prioritize profits over public interest and human rights. Corporations have secured seats at decision-making tables on public policies, regulations, and programs at multiple levels, from subnational to international. Using so-called scientific knowledge and evidence, they frame issues and problems, propose solutions, set standards, and shape institutions and structures and processes. But corporations have no legitimacy to make such decisions for the public. They're not democratically elected into public positions by people. They cannot be controlled by people, and they're certainly not accountable to people. On the contrary, regulatory and legal frameworks are increasingly moving in the direction of voluntary self-regulation, where corporations are rarely held responsible for material harm, environmental destruction, and human rights violations. Corporations use governance spaces to pursue their own private interests, and in so doing, they narrow the spectrum of political options on the table by which public interest, people's rights, and the environment can be protected. In trade and investment agreements, the interests of corporations are protected by hard law and investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms. However, the interests of workers, small-scale food producers, and people in general are relegated to voluntarism. Of particular concern to all of us is the expansion of corporate influence in international public institutions, especially those of the United Nations, whether on climate change, environment, biodiversity, food, water, health, and even human rights. Through partnerships with the United Nations, corporations are shifting global governance away from democratically accountable multilateralism to corporate-friendly, unaccountable multi-stakeholderism, where money carries more muscle than norms of equality, justice, and people's rights. It is important to keep in mind that all stakeholders are not rights holders. Corporations are not rights holders. And in many multi-stakeholder spaces and processes, these are characterized by huge asymmetries of power between governments, corporations, and people. Corporations dominated multi-stakeholder spaces, and corporate-dominated spaces are rife with conflicts of interest. The very actors that are responsible for the crisis we face now assume the power and authority to propose and push solutions, not through structural change and reparations for the impacts of their operations, but through expensive proprietary technologies and products, increased control over natural wealth, land, and resources, and domination of markets through vertical and horizontal integration. There's, of course, a lot more that can be said about corporate capture, but I will leave that to our speakers to delve deeper into these issues. So now let's turn to our first round of speakers, Michael Fakhri and Sofia Monsalve. Our first question to them is, how would you compare multilateralism with multi-stakeholderism? in terms of responsive policy making, ensuring the centrality of human rights and democratic accountability. How are these two approaches playing out in the United Nations Food Systems Summit? Now, first we will hear a recorded message from Michael Fakhri, because as Nora said, it's the middle of the night from him. And after that, we will hear from Sofia. So may we have Michael's response, please?
Thank you for inviting me to be part of the Counter-Mobilization. It is an honor to be here. Unfortunately, because the time of this panel is 4 in the morning where I live, I'm unable to attend live. I should explain quickly who I am and how I am positioned so you can assess my remarks from that context. As the UN's Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, the Human Rights Council has authorized me to be the leading independent expert on questions of food security and nutrition. The operative word here is independent. I also hold a unique position as I am both a member of the Food Systems Summit Integrating Team and the CFS Advisory Group. As a result, I have been privy to the main conversations and debates within and surrounding the Food Systems Summit. My remarks today draw from my report that I have just submitted to the UN General Assembly. One key way that the Food Systems Summit has privileged corporate-friendly perspectives has been through its multi-stakeholder process. Generally speaking, a multi-stakeholder process is designed to include people representing everyone who has a stake in a particular issue. At first, you might think this is a good thing. In the context of food systems and the way the summit was framed, everyone in the world is a stakeholder. But if everyone can jump into a process with no clear rules, then those with power can dominate the process. Multi-stakeholder governance also leaves the role of national governments unclear and does not address their role as the main duty bearers. The result is that those with the most power and wealth can devote the necessary resources to influence the process. Multi-stakeholder governance ignores existing imbalances of power. It creates a system of privilege that actively marginalizes and excludes most people. This is all made even worse when you add all the barriers to participation caused by the pandemic. In the Food Systems Summit multi-stakeholder process, some national governments found their involvement poorly coordinated across the different ways they could participate in the lead up to the summit. A number of national governments have regularly reported to me that the Food Systems Summit has not provided a clear and effective role for national governments. The only clear role for governments has been convening member state dialogues within their own countries through the food system process. Now, from within the Food Systems Summit process, many of us regularly voiced our concerns to the Secretary General and to the Food Systems Summit Secretariat that the whole process was complex and confusing. While there were some efforts to respond to our concerns, these efforts were superficial and were taken too late to redirect the process. The Food Systems Summit process has been open. Anyone could walk in and participate, but for most people and many governments, navigating it was like walking in a labyrinth where the walls were always shifting. Turning now to multilateralism. For multilateralism, the starting premise is that national governments are the source of authority for international norms and action. This premise grants all countries, at least, formal equal political power. For example, this ensures a small country has more political and procedural power than a rich company or philanthropic organization. But we all know that formal procedural power based on sovereign equality does not overcome the structural imbalances of power. Nevertheless, I think starting with multilateralism is the bare minimum. It is what allows countries to work together in solidarity. My main concern with multilateralism is that it leaves all the power in the hands of governments. If you think about it, multi-stakeholder governance is a response to this concern. But a multi-stakeholder process puts the power in the hands of the wealthy. Multilateralism becomes an even more legitimate process when combined with human rights, where rights holders participate by way of entitlement. So if governments bring the power of authority, people bring the power of legitimacy. Because if you only have authority without legitimacy, you are left with oppression. The biggest substantive problem with the Food Systems Summit is that it is putting forward proposals on how to transform the world's food systems, but it has ignored the fact that we are in the midst of a global pandemic. In this way, a lot of the summit is based on a fantasy in which COVID-19 and the current food crisis magically disappears. People are already transforming their food systems to survive. It will be the relationships that people develop to tackle the current food crisis and the ideas that come from those relationships that will build a better future. Only through multilateralism will countries suffering the most in the pandemic be able to articulate their needs and cooperate with each other. And only through human rights will governments be able to serve the people. Thank you.
A very big thank you to, can you hear me? Yeah. A very big thank you to Michael Fakhri, the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, for his message. He's raised some very important points, particularly the dialectic between authority, power, and legitimacy. Now let's move to Sofia Monsalve, who's joining us live. Sofia, your response to the same questions, please.
Bien, muchísimas gracias,
Thank you
Shalmal.
so much, Shalmali, and a very warm good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's an honor for me to be with you today. I'm Sofia Monsalve, and I work for FIAN International. It's a human rights organization working for the right to food and nutrition. And I will share my reflections from this perspective as a human rights defender. The UN Food System Summit claims it is a summit of the people. It says it's a very innovative summit because it's not just a summit of states, but of multiple stakeholders, meaning representatives from the field of science, corporations, philanthropy organizations, international NGOs, and some few social organizations. The summit claims to be very inclusive and open because literally anyone can participate virtually, obviously, in this summit, and where different types of dialogues have played, in theory, a prominent role. It would therefore seem that the summit is an exemplary model of democracy and participation. Well, if that were to be the case, we wouldn't be here today, clearly expressing our disagreement with this multiple stakeholderism approach that this summit is trying to consolidate at a scale never seen before. As the Special Rapporteur said, this model doesn't have any clear rules. And where you don't have clear and agreed rules, and for those who have to submit to those rules, then the powerful will dominate the game. And this is what happened with this summit. A few countries from the north, scientists also from the north, forums and councils that defend the interests of transnational corporations, philanthropic organizations, and international NGOs define the main lines and the agenda for this summit. And this explains why the summit is suggesting some solutions and not others. Why, for instance, didn't they discuss about how to end the wars in Yemen or Syria and in other countries where war and occupations are the main culprits for hunger? Why on issues like external debt, agricultural trade, or food reserves, why weren't they discussed? Why wasn't the inaction track dedicated to improving the regulatory capacity of states and the international community so that transnational corporations pay more taxes, for instance, so that they don't continue to deforesting and get land and water and destroying forests, and to prohibit the production, trade, and use of highly dangerous pesticides. These topics that are of the interests of countries at war or least developed countries and to the poorest population that is facing multiple crises were completely ignored. However, the summit took a great interest on technological solutions to apparently overcome sustainability and malnutrition issues. This multiple stakeholder models, according to which corporations are a fundamental part of a governance model, requires all parties to agree, meaning that corporations must grant their consent when discussing policies and programs. And this hugely restricts the spectrum of public policy options and restricts it to global market solutions that favor the interests of these corporations. It'll be impossible to take regulatory measures for the public good and to protect human rights if they are subject to consent from corporations. Multilateralism, of course, isn't perfect and never was perfect, but it does offer greater possibilities to the less developed countries so that they can articulate their interests by forging alliances. Given the extreme wealth and power concentrations that we see today at a global level, giving up the capacity of redistributing wealth and resources through the public power that are illegitimately in the hands of corporations makes the UN and our national democracies and coexistence at risk. So therefore, we should ask ourselves, why are the states giving up their prerogatives and roles to regulate for the public good and human rights? We would like to hear the answers to this question from our governments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sophia. That's a question that we have been asking our governments repeatedly, because in international spaces, we defend the rights of governments to regulate, we defend state sovereign rights to protect their people and to make decisions on behalf of their people. But when we come back home, we find that democratic process is compromised in a number of different ways. So yes, there is much deeper dialogue to be had with our governments on these issues. Now I hand over to Nora for the next block of questions. Thank you, Nora.
Thank you, Charles. It's important to understand the concepts, not necessarily easy to understand, with which we're dealing. And I think Michael and Sofia have done a good job of, and Shalmali have done a good job of at least opening up this box. But sometimes these concepts can sound a bit abstract, particularly to people who are located on the ground, unless we look at them in practice, when they're applied to a particular issue or a national context. And in this block, we're trying to take a look at the implications for public policy making, looking at 3 cases: COVID-19, agroecology, and Palestine. And we're going to start with COVID-19, which indeed has already been introduced by Michael Fakhri in his statement. Jomo, if you don't mind, I think we're going to take Andre Luzzi first, so that you can hear from what he has to say, and maybe if you like, respond to that also when you take the floor. So I'm going to call first on Andre Luzzi from Brazil. He is with the Habitat International Coalition, and he facilitates the urban food insecure constituency in the coordination committee of the CSM. And the question is this, Andre, and this will be the same question to you, Jomo. The impacts of the COVID pandemic have revealed the fragilities and inequities inherent in the industrial food system and globalized food supply chains, and have pointed to the need, especially as Sofia was suggesting, for countries that are food import dependent and where a good proportion of the population depends on small scale production for their livelihoods. So the need to make policy changes aimed at promoting and protecting territorially embedded food provisioning. And yet civil society and supportive governmental actors such as the Africa Group in the CFS are having difficulty in obtaining agreement that the CFS adopt transformative global policy guidance on Global 19 due to strong opposition by the big commodity exporting countries and the corporations. So the question to you both is, what key issues need to be addressed at global level, for example, in the CFS, to promote radical transformation of food systems, learning lessons from the COVID-19 experience? Andre, the floor is yours.
Sí, muchas gracias, Nora.
Thank you so much, Nora. Thank you very much for that question. I think a key issue is that we need to recognize that we are the voices of legitimate rights holders. Really, we need to ensure that we have access to our rights, because clearly the pandemic has exacerbated all kinds of discrimination, racism and others. So we need to look at this and ensure that we transform food systems. The answer is not only in terms of changing processes, but also to change the political paradigm, change the economic system, because now we know that the responses cannot be in the conceptual framework that generated these crises. So if we look at the responses from society, we know that CSM has in fact produced reports and a very strong political declaration from the youth, laying out our demands for transformation. In this response, we coordinated our input, and we know that there needs to be an immediate change of the neoliberal system that commodifies food and encourages its commodification in all markets. We have to say no to all of food produced through an extractivist system. We need to ensure that food is a right, it's life, it's transcendental, and for us, it is very much key. It's fundamental that we ensure food sovereignty through processes that involve the population and also involve them in decision-making. With regards to food policy, we need to promote local food systems that are healthy, sustainable, based in agroecology. States and international institutions should prioritize agroecology as the most solid way of ensuring food, and we should also ensure that we support smallholders, and especially stopping the finalization of industrial agribusiness. We need to ensure that we increase public investment in agroecological solutions. We also need to ensure that we protect the right to land. We also need to look at our social biodiversity. In Brazil, we really need to find another type of economy. We need to ensure it's more based on society It's more also focused on solidarity, so there is an adequate access to food, and that there are popular solutions to ensure food for all, to promote a more broad involvement in access to land and water. So to end, we need to ensure that we break down structural discrimination against Indigenous peoples, immigrants, women, and we need to ensure that we can guarantee the acknowledgement of all knowledge, our wisdom, to produce healthy food for all. Along the same lines, we should also consider that from now, agroecological processes need to be integrated into our process to move past global hunger, because we have to also avoid future pandemics. So as to how we can show the feasibility of this kind of response, we need to change food systems. And in the CSM, we have, in fact, laid out our plans as to how we could systematically change pertinent policies. And we have communicated this to the CFS and how we can promote its convergence. We also acknowledge the need to establish more objective responses to their work and to plan responses to the CFS. We are very conscious of this is not sufficient, but we need to work on creating new strategies to ensure that there is adequate international governance, because we need to ensure that the impacts aren't felt for the next decades. So I think we need to commit now, as member states need to ensure that we have experts and science people from civil society. We need to concentrate our efforts to have more international cooperation. Thank you so much. We're all here together to ensure that we galvanize our will, our actions to eradicate hunger. So thank you very much. I give back the floor.
Thank you, Andre. And Jomo, this has given you a taste of the kind of impassioned defense of the need for radical change of the neoliberal system, the commodification of food that is the discourse in the CSM and that we're trying to promote in the CFS. As I give you the floor, I have already mentioned your affiliations, but I hope I won't disturb you if I add one additional one. Jomo was former ADG of the Economic and Social Department at FAO, and I personally had the great pleasure to collaborate with him when FAO was communicating very different economic messages than it is now. So Jomo, with that former hat as well, we would be very pleased to hear from you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nora. Thank you also to Shamali for this kind invitation. Greetings to all friends all over the world. Allow me to make a number of interventions which probably depart a little from the questions originally posed. I think it is useful for us to remember that the choice is really not between multi-stakeholderism and multilateralism. In fact, if you think about CFS is really a multi-stakeholder arrangement, but under the overall supervision of member states through essentially multilateral arrangements. The second point I'd like to make is to emphasize that a rights-based approach means different things to different people. For all of us in this conversation, we are thinking primarily about human rights, about people's rights, about citizens' rights, about farmers' rights, and so on and so forth. But when you go to the other types of discussions, you'll find that what is often meant by rights are property rights, contractual rights, and so on and so forth. So it's very important for us to remember the limitations and of a rights-based discussion, which is often ultimately grounded in a liberal discourse. The third point, I think, which is very important and which you correctly emphasized, Nora, is the whole question of the context in which we live. We have seen how many parts of the world have been transformed from net food exporters as recently as the 1980s and have become net food importers. The most clear case of this, and Ambassador Mubi may speak to this later, is the case of Africa. Africa was a net food exporter until the 1980s. But since then, partly because of trade liberalization, it has changed, transformed radically. Part of the problem, of course, is the transition from the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade to the World Trade Organization. This required a one-size-fits-all single commitment approach. And what we have found is that the kinds of flexibilities in the old arrangements which existed for developing countries who were not able to compete in manufacturing or perhaps in agriculture and so on and so forth, they did not have to sign on to new commitments because those were not commitments which were required by GATT. But now this is no longer the case. And this has fundamentally threatened developing countries. Another major problem in this context is the whole question of tariffs versus subsidies. With WTO, subsidies are allowed, but tariffs are not allowed. Now, poor countries, or all developing countries, have resorted to tariffs as a way of changing their circumstances, but they are no longer able to do so, or less able to do so compared to before as a consequence. Another very, very major problem, which has been highlighted, as you correctly mentioned earlier, by the COVID-19 pandemic, is the problem of intellectual property rights, which have been greatly strengthened. And this is a major new innovation from 1995 with the advent of the WTO. This has been, although, for example, the late President Mandela fought very hard and succeeded in getting the public health exception to the TRIPS agreement, we have seen how intellectual property rights have been asserted, despite the fact that we have clearly an emergency of huge proportions facing us. But there has been an unwillingness by the rich countries to even consider a significant waiver as far as medicines are concerned. Now, the situation is far worse as far as agriculture, as farmers, access to seeds and so on and so forth are concerned. And this will basically pose a great number of problems. As I'm running out of time, let me quickly move on to emphasize that we have a situation now where international inequalities are growing rapidly. Part of the reason is developing countries are generally not able to mount strong fiscal responses, partly for a variety of reasons, which I cannot elaborate right now. And the other problem, of course, is the slow rate of vaccination in most developing countries, particularly the poor, as well as middle-income countries who cannot afford to vaccinate much faster. This will result not only in increased inequalities among countries, but very, very importantly, it is going to worsen the nature of the pandemic because it will allow more mutations and so on and so forth. We have a very sad situation in the world today where there are now incentives for the companies concerned not to develop a 100% proof vaccine. Already we have seen companies developing their medium-term term strategies on the basis of producing and supplying booster shots for new variants. This is a very troubling development, and you can imagine some of the consequences of food agriculture and other matters. Let me stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jomo. You've helped to clarify a couple of points that we need to be attentive to, because when we use terms, we have to understand what it is we're talking about. You've also pointed at some key issues around trade that we need to look at. And what you have said about COVID, I think, is for us, gives us the hope that this whole situation is going to sensitize governments in the global south to how badly they are being treated by the present governance system and to make the necessary changes in the multilateral approaches. Just one word, we consider the CFS to be an example, not perfect, but the best we have, of inclusive multilateralism, in part because, as you point out, it's the governments in the end who decide, and hence, at least in theory, can be held accountable, in part because the interface with civil society is autonomous and self-organized, which is not the case in multi-stakeholder arrangements and not the case in the Food Systems Summit, and in part because of the really innovative science policy interface we have that the next panel will be getting into. So thank you so much for these interventions. I think this gives us a lot of food for thought and for further discussion. But we'll have to move on now to the second concrete issue that we're taking a look at, and this is the agroecological transition, which, as you all know, is a key point for civil society and social movements. It was already discussed in the earlier scenario of the earlier session, but we're going to be looking at it particularly from a governance viewpoint. And so I would like to give the floor first to Isa Alvarez of Urgency, the community-supported agriculture network. And I would like to ask you, Isa, it's clear that agroecology is widely advocated and practiced as a prime foundation of resilient and equitable food systems and healthy and sustainable diets, yet the CFS has failed in its recent negotiations to clearly distinguish between agroecological approaches and quote unquote other innovations based on corporate owned technologies, contradicting the high-level panel of experts report on which they were based. So the question to you, what would an international publicly supported program promoting the transition from industrial agriculture to agroecology look like? What difference would it make if such a program were designed in an inclusive multilateral forum or in a multi-stakeholder platform like the Food Systems Summit? The floor is yours, Isa.
Thank you very much, Nora, for giving me the floor. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. Now, on this question about what the main difference would be, well, I could reply to this very briefly, and obviously I could take much longer, but I'm going to try and just summarize it by sharing 4 main points with you, 4 points that have been lacking in the recent negotiations on agroecology as well as in the food systems guidelines. If we really and truly want to achieve an agroecological transition, the first thing we need to do is to show that the planet has limits. It seems so obvious, and yet we have seen that during negotiations, this point has been vetoed. We have not been able to say in writing that the planet has limits. Additionally, what we have seen with COVID-19, what it has made us conscious of as a species is that we cannot dominate the world because nature also has its own voice and response. We should also not confuse real food with simple products, edible products, products which feed a market rather than people. So, what are the main differences? It's about who creates the framework, who sets the agenda. We have already discussed this with regard to multi-stakeholder arrangements. Who is taking decisions in an agroecological transition? What we ask is to mainly involve food producers, the main actors, those people who are feeding the world, those who are the most affected by everything that is happening around us. As we have said before, this would mean to put at the center of our discussions human rights and to not argue against this. what we are seeing today is that human rights are being negated over and over again in these different discussions. Therefore, any agroecological transition should not have to see itself having to negotiate the human right to adequate food and nutrition. It should be clear that it is the main pillar. And therefore, if our discussion is underpinned by human rights, what we need is to identify and respect the indivisibility of human rights and to take a more holistic approach. So therefore, we also need to be able to practice accountability. Something that we have often heard lately is the need for evidence. But precisely over the last year, we have been able to show evidence that the responses of different states have not been effective. And I'm talking to you from the Spanish state, where we have witnessed that children who haven't been able to access their school meals, for instance, have found themselves being fed by the local government. And in the case of Madrid, they reached an agreement with Telepizza, a pizza chain, to feed school children, therefore financed by public funds. Children have seen themselves eating fast food for months on end. And yet people who have small gardens, small vegetable plots, have not had access to their allotments, for instance. This is quite funny because doors were closed, if you like, to be able to access these allotments. And yet public support, public funds have not been available to support these types of initiatives where people have managed to actually provide up to 40% of food provisions to families by self-organizing, by producing agroecological food, and yet they haven't received public support. But they have been able to demonstrate, to show that they're able to feed people, to feed families with local agroecological produce. So what we have to reanalyze here is what is at the center of our discussions. We have often spoken about the essence over the last few months. And when we talk about an agroecological transition, what is therefore at the heart? What is the essence of our argument? Of course, it's human rights, it's the planet's health, and this has to come before the market. And as André said, it's precisely this model that has caused the crisis that we currently find ourselves in. So just to conclude, when we start analyzing different proposals that mention agroecology, and we've learned this at the CFS during the recent negotiations, it's not just about mentioning this word agroecology. It's about identifying the priorities of the proposals. It's about identifying which actors are at the center of these proposals and what is the essence of these proposals. Also, what type of knowledge is being put forward in order to solve the problems that we're currently facing. So what we have to do is take a human rights approach to all proposals that come our way, to understand that the right to food is a common goal, and agroecology is not just simply one option. We have to consider agroecology as the only possible option for real transformation. Thank you, and back to the floor.
Thank you, Isa. And it's now my very great pleasure to address the same question to Mary Mubi, who is the warmly remembered and deeply regretted former ambassador of Zimbabwe to the Rome-based agencies and the CFS. And it's a particular pleasure to see you again, Mary. I know I'm speaking for others as well as myself. Since she left Rome, Mary has returned to Zimbabwe and hence has an excellent perspective, I'm sure, to share with us on this whole question of global national dynamics. So Mary, over to you.
Thank you, Nora. It's a great pleasure to see you and Jomo and others. and I hope that I can contribute to this very important topic. Let me first of all start by saying that in addressing the question of how an international publicly supported program to transition from industrial to agroecological production can be seen at national level. I think one of the major problems we always have with new terms is that you always have to unpack them. Because with new terms, the assumption is that nothing is being done on the ground. And ecological systems really, in my view, are looking at communities, how communities work together, how they farm together. And it's important that in unpacking this term, that we look at what is already being done in order to promote agroecological practices and to enhance those areas, particularly with respect to innovations and technologies that in many African contexts were somewhat stalled in developing further so that they could cope with the processing of small grains and develop innovations and technologies that would meet the demands of changing diets. Let me also say that, as Jomo has put it, Zimbabwe, like other African countries, have become net importers of crops and plants that are not indigenous to the continent. And I would suggest that an internationally publicly supported program to transition to an agroecological production would require the support of national food tables. Can you believe that we are still reliant on food tables that prioritize foods that are not indigenous to many of our countries? And therefore, even when we talk about diversity of diets, we are talking about diversity of diets of crops that are not grown in our own context. And that's the challenge for many countries, is having national food tables that inform and also provide a basis for mobilizing and also popularizing indigenous crops. We have found more recently that as we are facing the new diseases, first of all, HIV and AIDS, COVID, and others, that people are turning to local solutions. And therefore, people are looking to local plants, local foods, to give them solutions to new diseases. And I believe that if we have national food tables that clearly show the nutritional value, the nutrition dense crops, indigenous crops that are grown, how they are preserved, how they are consumed, and popularize this knowledge across countries. And the value of such tables is that in most African countries, particularly in Southern Africa, we share common crops. So the research that is being done on some small grains is being done in Kenya. It may not be done in Zimbabwe, but one could popularize the findings that are being found in Kenya so that in fact we create these tables. But on the basis of these tables and also assigning the value, nutritional value to the indigenous crops, we could then popularize the indigenous diets which provide us with diversity. Because our diets are not sufficiently diversified because we are importing many of the food items that are on our tables. Can you believe that the popularity of pasta and other foods have grown, particularly amongst the young, and yet we have indigenous crops that are highly nutritious, but require support. And part of this support is an understanding of their nutritional value. I also believe that once we have mapped the indigenous crops in the country, and this could be done with the support at international level, supporting governments, then the issue of aggregation of smallholders. I don't think these crops are grown by smallholder farmers, but the aggregation could be done by aggregating smallholder farmers to process such plants and also provide the growing populations in urban areas with highly nutritious food crops. So I believe that it does not necessarily mean that once you scale up, you are necessarily talking about large-scale farmers. I believe that there is an opportunity for aggregation among smallholder farmers, but on the basis of an understanding of the key crops, indigenous crops that are prevalent in a particular area, their seasonality, and other factors that would assist in ensuring that such farmers come together and work together in aggregation, in processing, and therefore reaching a wider market. And lastly, it is true that the importation of crops from other countries, which has to some extent made our own indigenous crops, orphan crops, has meant that the dietary patterns amongst young people favors imported foods rather than locally grown foods. And the popularization and champions at national level. Here in Zimbabwe, we have seen a growing interest, particularly post-COVID, because people are looking whilst they are waiting for vaccinations to come to their communities, people are looking for local solutions, and many have turned to indigenous crops. And but we need now to popularize, to assist them with the science and understanding of the value of these crops, so that in fact, in propagating some of these crops and plants and insects in some cases, that it's based on a scientific approach. And the popularization will demand that we work in a multi-sectoral way at national level. And I can already begin to see some of these things happening with the local farmers, the hospitality sector. We are finding that our hotels more and more, because the population is demanding local indigenously grown crops, they are demanding indigenous diets. You are finding the menus are now reflecting more and more of these crops. But as I said at the beginning, we need to have a popularization movement. But in order for agroecological production systems to take root, we really need to unpack, because a number of these practices are already taking place in our communities. We need to support what is happening at local level. And sometimes with new terms comes bewilderment and confusion, but there's a lot of local knowledge that is there that can support these approaches. It is just a question of now trying to enhance some of the practices that were stalled because of the introduction of new technologies. So I believe that there are opportunities that are inherent in institutions such as CFS promoting regional and national governments to promote these practices and creating these platforms that support local initiatives so that we make use of what is God-given at the local level. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. I think there's enormous coherence among what you have said, what Isa has said, and what the speakers on COVID also were talking about. I wish we had more time to discuss this, but this is all food for thought and for work going forward. I'm going to have to move on quickly now because, alas, we're running out of time, and I need to hand back to Shalmali with a decent amount of time for the third question. So I will move straight to Ahmed from the Gaza Urban and Peri-Urban Agricultural Platform. And Ahmed, I'm going to keep you strictly to your 5 minutes. If you can do it in less, that would be even better, to talk to us about how the international dynamics of corporate interests and the geopolitical interests of powerful states impact on food systems in Palestine, and how the interest and rights of small-scale producers and local communities can be defended. Over to you, Ahmed.
Yes, thank you very much, my dears. And I would like to start from the last point. It's really very important to build on the already existed strategies developed and initiated by the local communities, local vulnerable communities, especially the communities who are living in a protracted crisis conditions like the situation in Palestine and Gaza. I would say that the key actors within the local food system space in Palestine are not matured enough. And that is as a result of the Israeli occupation policies, procedures along the past decades. So neither the government, neither the local civil society organizations, as well as the private sector are matured enough or given the opportunity or the space to do any intervention or to practice their normal role in the local community development. What I would like to say is that part of our reflection on the multi-stakeholderism, I think in Palestine, on the light of these big challenges, the community-led initiatives really gave a very important results and very important initiatives, and the development of the local, I would say, positive coping strategies along the past years. Yes, the Palestinian community has managed to develop a lot of these strategies that played a key role in the enhancing its resilience under the very critical situation like war, COVID-19, the occupation itself, the siege on Gaza, as well as in the West Bank, the not having the access for the local resources. So this is the one quick example for the community-led initiative in response to the multi-stakeholderism, and this is part of our experience, is that facilitating a local forums where the local poor farmers, vulnerable farmers, men and women, have the opportunity, the space to exercise their power and to express their needs and to protect their rights, and even to invite those in power, to invite them and having a direct policy dialogue and trying to influence their policies and decisions, etc. Whether they are from the government, whether they are from the some international NGOs or donor organizations, because those actors playing a key role in the formalization of the life and the situation here, and that's part of our understanding for the promotion and the importance to promote food sovereignty, as well as the resilience as we understand it. We understand resilience as a steadfastness by the local community and building on the already existed resources, local knowledge, as well as the agroecological practices that are still existed in our communities, and it is needed to be well protected. Hello? Hello?
Yes, we hear you.
Yes, sorry, we have electricity cut quickly. Yes, it's coming back now. Okay, that's very quickly. Maybe there is no time, but my last point to all of us, to all our community initiatives, community-led initiatives, movements in different parts of the world, understanding the power dynamics, existed power dynamics is the important entry point for the local vulnerable communities, for the farmers, to better understand, analyze these power dynamics, and then that could be the starting point to build their own influencing strategies and advocacy rights, protection, and activism. That's very important. I think from our experience on the ground here in Palestine. Thank you very much, my dears.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. Nora, would you like to say something, or shall I move straight into the third question?
Nora is just fell out of the call. Shamali, she asked you to continue.
Okay, all right. So thank you, Ahmed, and thank you to all the speakers in the last block. I mean, there's, as you know, we've said before, lots of food for thought, all the way from all the speakers, from starting from Michael to now. And we've covered such a range of issues, you know, from the issues of legitimacies and power and agency and multilateralism and the limits of multilateralism and the issues of power and asymmetries of power, the issues of the World Trade Organization, and the realignment of global economies, and then what's happened with the pandemic and the context, planetary boundaries, the issue of local resilience, staples, power dynamics. So we've covered a whole range of issues, all of which point to the importance of new political imaginations and new directions in order to be able to transform the governance, the global the governance of food and the governance of food systems from national to international global levels. So let's look into this for a minute. I mean, for the last part of our panel. So we have a question for all the panelists. And the question is, should governance processes be shaped at national and international levels and between the two, between national and international levels, to ensure that public interests and people's rights, voices and needs, especially those who are most affected and vulnerable. So how do we ensure that these voices and needs and interests are at the center, that corporations are regulated, and that governments are held accountable? So it's a big ask, but we go back to all the speakers and request everybody to present maybe just 3 proposals or 3 key measures within 3 minutes for transformative measures for a really deep, radical transformation of the governance of food. So let's start again with a video recording of Michael Fakhri, and then we will follow the panel as they spoke.
I can quickly answer this final question in bullet form. I'll focus on what national governments can do. So governments must strengthen international multilateral forums such as the CFS and its high-level panel of experts, with an emphasis on indigenous and local knowledge, including human rights expertise. Governments should enact and enforce laws that limit growing corporate concentration of power in food systems, and they must hold corporations accountable for human rights violations. Governments should enact the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and Other People Working in Rural Areas, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples through national policy and legal frameworks. And finally, governments must ratify and enact ILO treaties and enforce national labor laws. But I'd like to also provide an ambitious way to think about the problem of corporate power. The high concentration of corporate power allows a relatively small group of people to shape markets in a way that serves the ultimate goal of shareholder profit maximization and not the public good. However, the underlying problem is that individuals use corporations to ensure that they will not be held responsible for their human rights violations. This is by design. Corporations were invented for the very purpose of limiting individual liability and reducing the risk of investment. States must at least limit corporate power and regulate corporate conduct, but to ensure the full realization of human rights, the validity of the corporate form itself must be challenged. The function of a corporation is to allow individuals, shareholders, to pool their resources to make something or provide a service. People can collectively organize themselves in different ways through partnerships, cooperatives, public bodies, or worker-controlled entities. That said, a corporation organizes resources in a particular way. It reduces an individual investor's risk by limiting shareholder liability for the wrongdoing of the enterprise. Corporate law and governance turn corporations into legal persons with a great number of rights and very few binding obligations. As a result, corporate law enables individuals to reap all the gains, and not be held responsible for any social harms that are generated by the profit-making enterprise. So then if you add the element of investment law, well, investment treaties grant transnational corporations rights that are stronger than local communities' tenure and human rights, without including any corporate obligations. The corporate form, combined with international investment treaties, allows investors to evade and avoid domestic liability in their host state. This has excused corporations from local labor and environmental laws, leading to an increase in human rights violations in global value chains. So the question that I will leave you with is this: why are corporations allowed to exist in our food systems in the first place? Thank you and congratulations for overcoming your differences and coming together in solidarity.
Well, that was a big thank you to Michael, although he can't hear us right now. And certainly, one of the things that Michael has done in his response is pose the problematization of rights and the rights discourse, not in terms of its shortcomings, but the way it's picked up and manipulated. And I think Jomo also referred to this, that terminologies mean different things for different people. And what we assume in a normative discourse is quite different, often in a more legalistic discourse, depending on the context it's in. So now let me hand the floor over to Sofia. Same question, Sofia. What shall we do with the transformative measures for the governance of food?
Gracias, Chal.
Thank you so much, Chal. I'd just like to mention 2 or 3 of these. Firstly, we need to strengthen public institutions and communal institutions. Public institutions are the ones that are controlled and managed by the government. They are extremely important for food systems. Public policies on public procurement, for instance, everything relating to food reserves and how to protect ourselves from price volatility, and there are many others. So we need to strengthen these public institutions. We need to make them democratic beyond any doubt, and we have to strengthen communal institutions, that is, cooperatives, popular food councils. There are many expressions of these communal institutions, and right now, precisely with the pandemic, we have realized how essential food systems are, especially to respond to the needs of those who are most affected by food insecurity. I think this is something we should pay close attention to in the future. At the same time, while we strengthen these public and communal institutions, we also need to find enough strength to deal with all the regulatory aspects. It has to do with what I was saying before, and how we regulate corporations, financial capital, how we decommodify the food system. And this means banning the use of agrotoxics. agrochemicals. Isa was recalling how difficult this topic was during the CFS discussion on the guidelines on food systems and nutrition and the recommendations on agroecology. This is one topic, but there are others. There's corporate accountability because of the ecological damage, because of harms done to labor rights in society. So we need to recover the public space when talking of food systems. And for this, we need to redistribute power. We need to increase taxation. We have to dismantle monopolies that some corporations have in certain sectors. And even as we heard this morning from Jim Thomas, we have to dismantle the intellectual monopolies that base their power in monopolizing and limiting access to knowledge. And this includes Amazon and all of the big data corporations. Thank you.
Thank you, Sofia. So now I move to Andre. Andre, same question.
Sí. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much. Well, I think some of the points are essential. During this times of with the pandemic, the situation was dramatic. Most countries, we couldn't believe that many countries weren't readily available to come up with a stronger response. We need a greater commitment of member states and international organizations. We think this other way of doing multilateralism has to be built together with the people on the ground, the subject of rights. And we have to guarantee a new perspective of international cooperation so that we can strengthen countries that are less developed, but we must also include the role of local organizations such as municipalities and provinces as fundamental actors. We also need greater cooperation among the peoples. It's fundamental because responses are often found in the community. So what we can learn from this process is that we urgently need to deal with the social function of supply services. Supplies are now in the hands of corporations, but services are a communal service. They belong to all of us. And also the issue of food culture. It has to find an expression in international organizations. For instance, UNESCO must also work with us when discussing food cultures in a stronger way. And we also need the different international organizations to be present. And last but not least, we need to be able to make justice systems accessible. With this pandemic, it has been made evident that we need to better demand our human right to food, and we must call on ministries and prosecutors' offices to give a role to popular lawyers, popular defenders that can help us guarantee the human right to food during times of crisis such as this one. And finally, I think we need to guarantee a response for places that live with protracted crisis so that we can have a holistic approach in these more sensitive spaces so that we can guarantee international solidarity amongst our peoples. Thanks for the floor. And as I said, we need to stop corporations and we need to guarantee public systems that can ensure the human right to food. Thank you, and over.
Thank you, Andre. I move straight to Jomo. Jomo, your proposals.
Shamali, I think it's important. Let me make 3 points. First, I think it's very important for us not only to emphasize, but to educate the public more generally and governments that only agroecology is consistent with sustainability, which is an overarching commitment of the United Nations system, of the United Nations-led multilateral system. This is very important for us to emphasize, but also to demonstrate. And we should not allow agroecology to be dismissed as a marginal thing, which is only involving traditional knowledge, which is only involving indigenous communities and so on and so forth. It is so easy for us to get painted into a corner by allowing others to do this to us. We need to recognize that agroecology involves research, it involves knowledge sharing, and very, very importantly, it involves extension, because new knowledge is being created all the time by the collaboration of farmers and others with scientists and so on. And this is very important for us to disseminate very effectively. Secondly, I think it's very important for us to keep pushing about the illegitimacy and biasness of various international regulations as well as institutions. We need to expose, for example, how the intellectual TRIPS arrangement has been so biased, particularly against developing countries. We need to expose, for example, that an intellectual property is essentially a monopoly. And when we talk so about fighting monopolies and we allow this kind of monopolies, this is simply unacceptable. We need to also support important initiatives which may not be the best, but necessarily provide us with some breathing space. For example, we've seen how Madam Yellen, the US Treasury Secretary, has pushed for a corporate income tax for all countries. And what we need to do is to embrace that principle, in fact, to raise the level of taxation, but instead to ensure that this is basically shared equitably, especially with developing countries. The third thing, of course, is to change national regulations appropriately in line with our very specific circumstances, because there is no one-size-fits-all solution to many of the problems which we face. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jomo. I turn now to Isa. Isa, same question, please.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, como hay much, as there isn't a lot of time, I'm just going to say two quick things. First of all, with regards to methods, etc., I think that one of the great discussions or disputes we have is about legitimacy. Is where is legitimacy situated? I'm not going to reiterate what I said about methods, because I know a lot of you will know, and if you read our vision document for food systems, and we clearly enumerate loads of different recommendations and things that we do and that we can see from our various perspectives. I saw that there was a question in the Q&A area about the CAP and EU policy here in Europe. I'd just like to say that we want agroecology to be inclusive. We want agroecology to ensure that the market are just a tool, but the CAP and Green Pact and everything has the market as the center and the focus, not just one tool amongst others. So essentially, we want to be orientated around other centers, like people's needs, common goods, the planet itself, not just to feed into a wider market, which is not going to provide any meaningful solutions. So, I mean, like, you can dress it up however you want in terms, but focus can't be the market if you really want to change anything. And I'll just leave it at that. Thank you so much. And thank you, Nora and Shal, for all of your work. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Isa. Thank you. I turn to Mary Mubi now. Ambassador Mubi, please. The same question, your proposals for transformation of the governance of food.
I think one of the key take-homes from the crisis and the mitigation strategies that have been adopted by, well, in our own case, our own government, is understanding that one has to strengthen local systems. The fact that there's been a failure in trade, that many of the things that we were importing, be it foodstuffs or medicines, are no longer available, has forced many governments to look inward to support more research. And therefore, we must use these crises as a way of strengthening local systems, knowledge sharing, and the capacities of local people to look into problems that are specific to a particular locality. I think this has been an eye-opener for our government, that there are local capacities that are available within the country that can also transform our food systems and also ensure that we have the necessary capacities to be able to feed the nation. For the first time this year, we have a bumper harvest. And this is because our government has put resources into local production. But also, I believe that with respect to governance, we often think of governance with respect to international or at national level. But I also believe that there should be encouragement at local level for local producers to come together, because in coming together, it does not mean that they therefore transform into large corporations, but they bring their energies together to do certain things that are better done when you aggregate your production. I believe that in terms of governance, I think the encouragement of local producers to look and see how they can come together and work to ensure that they do certain processes that can only be done at scale, at local level, I think is extremely important. I think also the issue of the one-size-fits-all mentality that sometimes sometimes is adopted at international level is something that we must fight vigorously, because there are local solutions, there are knowledge spaces, there is knowledge being created at local level, and people are not just waiting for new knowledge to come from outside. We always have to unpack and see, and in fact, in many cases, we disempower our own people. What we need to do is to ensure that as we come with new ideas and knowledge from an international perspective, we ask the question, what is it that you have been doing that can assist, and what are the gaps? And therefore empowering people to further research at local level. And therefore, I think that the focus on local knowledge systems and local support for these systems is extremely important. I thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Ahmed, you have the last word, literally. Ahmed, can you hear me? Have we lost Ahmed?
Looks like yes.
Yes. Well, we have only 2 minutes left, and I don't think we have time for questions. But I think just the last 15 to 20 minutes of the different proposals that all our speakers have put forward, it's a whole rich, it's a feast, it's a banquet of wonderful ideas for transformation, which social movements have actually encapsulated into the paradigm of food sovereignty and people's sovereignty. And I don't think there is any way that I can try to summarize all the different ideas that are on the table. So I will just leave it with a big thank you and say that we will try and pull together all these ideas and make some kind of document. We will be preparing a documentation from it. Nora, would you like to say something in conclusion?
I would just like, as I've already done in the chat, to thank so much all of the members of this panel and to echo what you have said, Shal, this whole question of global governance, how to fight against multi-stakeholderism and how to improve multilateralism and how to do the kind of supportive work that Mary Mubi was talking about is very high on our agenda. We thank you all for your inputs, and we will for sure be carrying this forward and in touch with you.
Yes. So this is certainly not the end of this conversation and this exchange. We will continue to work with all of you to challenge corporate capture, to reimagine and use political, reimagine multilateralism, to figure out hybrid ways of governance from local to regional to international, and to build food sovereignty and context-specific solutions to the crises that we're facing. And of course, a very important aspect of that is real solidarity on the ground for people who are living under occupation and in protracted crises and wars. So thank you very much. Thank you very, very much to all our panelists. Thank you to my co-moderator, Nora. Thank you to all the people who participated, and we're very sorry we couldn't take any questions, but perhaps you can direct your questions to the panelists by email or through chats. So thank you, and I request your permission to close this session. A big thank you to all our interpreters. Very, very big thank you to all our interpreters who help us to communicate. Thank you.
Recording stopped.